Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Nazarene Baptist Church Sunday School. I'm Pastor Ed Holmes, and I am so happy that you decided to come in with us today and let us learn a few more things about the Lord and the Lord's Word. Of course, we're still using the same quarterly, and if you've got that quarterly, please open it now. If not, then turn to the scripture, Nehemiah, 2nd chapter, verses 11 through 20. That's where we're going to, it's a short lesson today, but nonetheless, it's a powerful lesson of how God can use his servants to do his will. And we're going to learn about Nehemiah today. The last couple of weeks we talked about Ezra. Ezra was a preacher. And we talked about Moses was a prophet. And but today we're going to talk about Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is in a whole different category. And we want to see that God can use any one of us. It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what you've done, where you've been, your training. God can use each one of us to carry out his will. And today we're going to find he's going to use Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a layman. You know, he doesn't come with any strong religious affiliation. He's just a laborer, a worker, a man who's got two hands that's available, and he's got a heart that he's going to give to God. So as we get into Brother Nehemiah today, we're going to learn a lot about ourselves, because we can do the same thing that God called him to do. We just got to have the resolve to do those things. The lesson is titled today, Nehemiah, the captive cupbearer rebuilds the nation. Now, I want you to think about it for a second. Now, this man hasn't done anything construction-wise, and he is not a builder of the church, and he hasn't done anything that would have us point to him saying he's a man that knows how to get things done. He is a layman. He's a layman. And what does that mean? That means that he doesn't have any strong religious background or affiliation. But God's going to use him. This man today is a cupbearer. Nehemiah is a cupbearer in the royal family. So let's step back for just a second and let's learn what a cupbearer is so we can see how God used him. A cupbearer was historically an officer or high-ranking person in the royal court. In other words, he worked directly for the king. He was working for the king. It was a very trusted position because what he does, or what he did as a cupbearer, is that he served the drinks that the king took. Whatever the king had to drink, the cupbearer brought it to him, and he tasted it first. And why did they do that? Because back at that time, there was always a possibility of a king being sabotaged, a king being poisoned, a king being disposed of. So what they needed to do was to have a person that was trustworthy. And Nehemiah was that trustworthy servant, high official, working for King Artaxerxes. And now we know that he was the king of Persia. And he was going to use Nehemiah, or Nehemiah was going to use him to get the authority to go back to Jerusalem and do those things. Now, the first thing Nehemiah did was that he went to the king, and he was feeling low, feeling bad. And the king asked him what was the problem, because the king had him working for a long time. So the king could see the changes in him. And he was concerned that the temple and the wall and the city of Jerusalem was still in ruins. It was 100 years later, and the city was still in ruins. And what he wanted to do was to get permission to go and rebuild this city and rebuild the wall. Now, the first part of the lesson is that the call. Nehemiah received permission from the king of Persia to return to Jerusalem to repair Jerusalem's wall. The people living there took notice of Nehemiah, because what he did, he went and he did a survey. He walked around all the destruction and all the building that had been destroyed, and the wall and the gates, and he did a survey. And nobody really knew what he was doing, but he was checking to see what needed to be done. So that's the first thing he did. And then what Nehemiah did, he had to convince people living there to help him. And that's what we have to do sometimes. People don't always see your glory. They don't always see your light. They don't always see the things that God has anointed you to do. But you've got to keep doing it, because in so doing, God will have them fall in line with you. Another part of the lesson is talking about, the opposition. People are always going to oppose you when you are called to do a service for God. People don't like what you're doing. They don't think you have the responsibility or the authority to do it. So they're going to beat you down. We'll find in this lesson that Nehemiah had the same situation. And the last thing we're going to talk about is the power. Nehemiah boldly answered that God gave him the authority to do what he's doing. God gave him the authority to do what he's doing. So we know he was a cupbearer, he was a layman, but God used him just like he used us. The first reading in our lesson is going to come from Nehemiah chapter 2, verses, 11 through, we can take this to 11 through 16. Yeah, we're going to do 11 through 15. And let's begin to read there. Nehemiah takes a scouting trip. In other words, he wanted to do a survey. He wanted to see how much work he had to get done. And I'm going to read from the NIV here. And I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one that I was riding. In other words, he only had a donkey. He didn't have any animals to help him work. He just had a donkey. That was the one he was sitting on. By night, I went out through the village gates toward the Jackal Well and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the Fountain Gate and the King's Pool, but there was not enough room for my mount, his donkey, to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the walls. Finally, I returned back and re-entered through the valley. Let's see what's important here. He did a survey of the city at night, and he wanted to see the extreme destruction that had occurred in the city. We're looking at destruction that has been there for over 100 years now. Because remember, Nehemiah was born at a time when they were in exile. So he's back looking at what's going on now, and it's been 100 years since they had anything to do with it. So what Nehemiah did as a cupbearer, he asked the king if he could go and do it. King Xerxes said, yes, what do you need? Gave him everything he needed, and he gave him a list of things, and the king made that possible, and he went on and did what he had to do. The second reading in our lesson is taken from verses 16 through 18. We're going to break it down in little pieces so we can get it. 16 through 18. The second reading says, the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any other who would be doing the work. In other words, he didn't tell people what he was doing. He just set out and he went out and did it, and he got some support. And of course, he did a great thing for the people of Israel. His job was to bring worship back to Israel, bring worship back to Jerusalem, because that's where it had started. The second reading is from Nehemiah 2, verses 17. We're going to 17 through 20. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me, and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But when sandblast